When CEO Elizabeth Carter stepped out of her black car in front of Sterling Dynamics headquarters that morning, she was already running on the kind of cold efficiency that had made her one of the most feared executives in the clean energy sector. She barely glanced at the rusted van parked crookedly near the front gate before she made her decision. With a single word to the head of security, the order was given, and within minutes, the tow truck had arrived. To her, it was nothing more than an eyesore, a piece of junk, cluttering the carefully curated entrance of a billion-dollar company. She turned her back on it without a second thought, her heels clicking across polished concrete as the van was hauled away from the curb and out of sight. But 17 minutes later, the engineering department called the boardroom in a panic. The one prototype capable of saving the biggest contract in Sterling Dynamics history was locked inside that van. And its owner, Mason Walker, a single father who had already been turned away by security, was gone. Stay with this story to the end, because the ruthless decision made that morning would bring a powerful CEO to her knees to ask for forgiveness she had not yet earned. The morning had begun like every other morning in Elizabeth Carter's world, precisely, purposefully, and without room for error. She arrived at the Sterling Dynamics campus in downtown Chicago at 7:52, 8 minutes before her first scheduled briefing. The building was a statement. 40 floors of glass and steel, its exterior a mirror of sky and ambition, its lobby outfitted with digital displays, scrolling Sterling's most recent breakthroughs in energy storage. Elizabeth had designed the look of this company, the way she designed everything in her professional life, with intention and an absolute intolerance for anything that did not belong. She had been named CEO 3 years ago, after steering Sterling through a near bankruptcy with what the financial press called surgical ruthlessness, and she had spent every day since reinforcing the idea that a company's outward image was inseparable from its credibility. She believed, in the way that people believe things they have never had reason to question, that if the outside looked right, the inside would follow. It was a conviction she had built her reputation on. Today, however, was not an ordinary Tuesday. Today was the day of the Northbridge Capital presentation, a meeting that the entire company had spent 6 months preparing for. Northbridge was one of the most selective investment groups in North America, led by a man named David Reynolds, who was known in financial circles for walking out of deals the moment he sensed weakness. The deal on the table was a $400 million contract to develop and manufacture miniaturized energy conversion units for a network of smart cities across 3 states. To win it, Sterling needed to demonstrate a working prototype of a compact, high-efficiency energy storage device. The company's internal development team had attempted to build one 4 separate times. 4 times, the device had failed testing. Time had run out. And in quiet desperation, Samuel Brooks, Sterling's head of engineering, had reached out to an outside inventor, a man named Mason Walker. Mason arrived at the Sterling campus at 8:14, behind the wheel of a 1997 Ford Econoline van the color of dried rust, with a cracked side mirror held in place by electrical tape and a rear bumper that rattled faintly over every pothole on the expressway. He had driven 2.5 hours from the small suburb where he lived, leaving before sunrise to make it on time. He was wearing a gray canvas work jacket that had faded to the color of old pavement, and there was engine grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing had fully removed. He looked tired in the way that people who carry a great deal look tired, not broken, but worn smooth, the way a river stone is worn by years of water moving over it. In the back of the van, wrapped in foam padding and secured in a custom wooden crate he had built himself, was the device he had spent 3 years of his life creating. He had called it HelioCore. Mason had exchanged emails with Samuel Brooks over the course of several weeks, and the appointment had been confirmed in writing. He expected to be met at the gate and walked inside, given a chance to let the work speak for itself. Instead, the security guard at the entrance checked the visitor log twice and informed him that his name was not registered under any VIP guest code, and that without proper clearance, he could not enter the campus. Mason explained he was there to see Samuel Brooks. The guard told him to wait outside. Mason waited. He called Samuel's office line. No answer. He sent an email from his phone. No response came. He stood beside his van in the morning cold, watching employees stream past him through the main gate without a glance in his direction. Elizabeth Carter arrived during this wait. She saw the van, and her eyes moved to it immediately. A rusted, out-of-place vehicle parked at the front gate of Sterling Dynamics on the most important morning in recent company history was not something she was willing to tolerate. She looked at the head of security and said 3 words: "Have it towed." She did not ask who owned it. She was already walking toward the entrance when Mason stepped forward and said, "Excuse me, there's a device in that van that your engineering department is expecting." Elizabeth slowed for one step, turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder, and said, "Call the main line and make an appointment." Then she walked through the glass doors and they closed behind her. Mason stood at the curb, watching the tow truck hook up to his van. He didn't argue with the driver. He stood with his hands at his sides, quiet, in the particular way of someone who has been dismissed so many times that the anger no longer rises loudly. It just settles, like sediment, into something heavier and more permanent. When the van disappeared around the corner, he picked up the tool bag he had set down on the sidewalk, looked at the building one long moment, and walked toward the bus stop. To understand what was driven away in that rusted van, it is necessary to go back a few years. Not far, but far enough. Mason Walker had studied mechanical engineering at a state university in Indiana, graduating with a degree and a reputation among his professors as someone who thought sideways through problems in ways that occasionally produced brilliant results. He had worked for a mid-sized manufacturing firm for 9 years, earning steady raises and modest recognition. Then his wife Karen was diagnosed with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy at 31 years old. She died 14 months later, in the autumn, on a Tuesday, while Mason was picking up their daughter Grace from school. He came home to a house that had already changed. He left his job the following spring and moved with Grace to a small rental house outside a town called Millbrook, where the cost of living was low enough that odd jobs and contract repairs could keep them housed and fed. He fixed diesel engines for local farms. He rewired aging electrical systems in commercial buildings. He built custom irrigation controllers for a greenhouse operation 30 miles east. And in the evenings, after Grace went to bed, he worked in the detached garage behind the house, surrounded by salvaged components, hand-drawn schematics taped to cinder block walls, and a level of focused quiet that he had come to depend on the way other people depend on sleep. HelioCore had started as a response to a problem he noticed while working on a small solar installation for a local community center. The storage units available on the market were either too large, too expensive, too inefficient at partial loads, or some unfortunate combination of all 3. He began drawing a different approach, a modular architecture that distributed heat management across the system rather than concentrating it, and a conversion circuit design that maintained high efficiency even at variable input levels. It took him 11 months to produce a design he believed in, another 8 to build the first physical prototype from scratch, using components sourced from surplus electronics dealers and salvaged machinery, and a 3rd year to test, fail, redesign, and test again until the device performed consistently across conditions he had deliberately made harsh. He had submitted the concept to 4 companies before Samuel Brooks wrote back. 2 had never responded. 1 had sent a form rejection. 1 had asked for a meeting, sent a detailed questionnaire about credentials and company size, and then gone silent. Samuel was different. He had found Mason through an engineering forum, read the technical summary, and sent a message that said, "This is the approach we've been trying to get right for 2 years. Can we talk?" They had spoken 3 times by video. Samuel had reviewed the test data and called it, privately, the most promising energy storage architecture he had seen at this scale. After the van was towed, Mason tried Samuel's number twice from the bus stop. Both calls went to voicemail. He left one message, calm and factual. The van had been towed, the device was inside, and he was heading home. What he did not know, as the bus carried him west out of the city, was that the external hard drive containing every test log Every calibration record, every design revision, and every raw data set from 3 years of development was secured in a padded case beneath the driver's seat. There was no cloud backup. There was no duplicate. Mason had been meticulous about keeping the technical record complete and together so he could answer technical questions on the spot. It was, in retrospect, a single point of failure in an otherwise careful system, and it was now sitting in a tow yard on the south side of Chicago. The Northbridge Capital representatives were already seated in the 14th floor conference room when Elizabeth arrived. David Reynolds sat at the far end of the table, flanked by 2 analysts and a legal advisor, and his expression communicated that pleasantries would not be part of the program. Reynolds had a reputation for ending meetings the moment he believed the people across from him were performing confidence rather than demonstrating it, and he had walked away from deals larger than this one on less provocation. Elizabeth laid out Sterling's vision with precision, the architecture of their energy grid integration platform, the projected efficiency gains, the market position in smart city infrastructure, the timeline to full-scale manufacturing. She spoke with the fluency of someone who had spent months absorbing every technical briefing her team had produced. And then she reached the part of the presentation that required a live demonstration, and she looked towards Samuel Brooks, seated along the wall behind her, and Samuel's face told her something had gone wrong before he said a word. The internal prototype had been warming up in the equipment room since 7 in the morning. When the technician powered it to full load for the demonstration, it ran for 4 minutes and 12 seconds before a thermal protection circuit triggered an automatic shutdown. The room temperature had been pushing the cooling system harder than the simulations had predicted. The screen at the front of the room showed the performance data, and then it showed a flat line. The silence that followed had weight. Reynolds looked at the flat line for a long moment. Then he looked at Elizabeth. "If Sterling doesn't have a working demonstration device by the end of business today," he said, "Northbridge will proceed with Meridian Energy. They have a working unit. It's less elegant than what you've described, but it works." He closed the folder in front of him with a sound like a quiet verdict. Samuel spoke before Elizabeth could respond. He said there was an alternative device, a prototype developed by an independent inventor, brought in as a backup, more advanced in several key performance metrics than anything Sterling had produced internally. The inventor's name was Mason Walker, and Mason had brought the device to the campus that morning for exactly this purpose. Mason's van had been towed from the front gate under the CEO's standing orders approximately 40 minutes ago. The quiet that followed was the silence of a person realizing the precise shape of what they had just done. Elizabeth asked whether the device was still in the van. Samuel confirmed it was at a city-contracted impound facility 12 miles away. He pulled up the HelioCore test data on his laptop and turned the screen toward Elizabeth. In 3 of the 5 primary performance metrics, HelioCore exceeded the specifications Sterling had promised Northbridge in writing. The efficiency curve was not close to the Sterling internal prototype. It was not in the same conversation. Reynolds agreed to give them until 6 o'clock that evening. He did not say this generously. They left for the impound facility. Within the hour, Elizabeth, Samuel, and executive assistant Jessica Monroe. The facility was staffed by a man named Earl, who had seen every kind of pressure tactic from every kind of person who had ever wanted a car released without following proper steps, and who was unmoved by all of them. He explained patiently that only the registered owner, Mason Walker, could authorize access or release. Elizabeth asked if there was any exception for business emergencies. Earl said there was not. Standing in the gravel parking lot, Samuel said something he had been composing since learning what had happened. He said it quietly, without drama. He said that Mason Walker was not a delivery driver or a stranger off the street. He was someone who had accomplished, alone, with salvaged parts in a rented garage, what an engineering team with a multi-million-dollar budget had been unable to accomplish after 4 attempts. Whatever Elizabeth had seen when she looked at that van and that man, it had been wrong. Elizabeth listened and did not respond immediately, which Samuel recognized as meaningful. Jessica had located Mason's address through the email chain. They drove to Millbrook. Mason was not at home. A neighbor, a retired librarian named Bonnie Harris, said he had left for an emergency repair job at a machine shop on County Road 11. The garage door stood open. From the driveway, they could see everything: the drafting table covered in annotated schematics, the pegboard of tools arranged with the obsessive neatness of someone who cannot afford to lose anything, the foam-padded testing rig in the corner, the whiteboard filled with calculations. Samuel stood at the garage door for a long moment, reading what was written there without speaking. On the edge of the drafting table, weighted down by a small metal bracket, was a photograph in a simple frame. Mason, a woman with dark hair and a wide smile, and a small girl with her father's eyes, all three of them squinting into sunlight somewhere ordinary, somewhere that no longer existed in that form. Elizabeth looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she looked away, and her face returned to the controlled expression she wore like armor. But something had shifted, and both Samuel and Jessica saw it. They found Mason at the machine shop on County Road 11, standing inside the access panel of a grain elevator drive housing, his right hand bleeding slightly from a cut, his coveralls dark with grease and metal dust. When he turned and saw Elizabeth standing in the doorway with Samuel beside her, his expression moved through recognition, confirmation, and a deliberate composure. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and waited. Elizabeth said the van needed to be retrieved, that the prototype inside it was the only device capable of meeting the terms of a critical demonstration that afternoon, and that she needed him to come with them to release it from the impound lot. Mason said he would not be going anywhere with her. He said he had arrived with an appointment, with a device specifically requested by Sterling's engineering department, and had been spoken over and dismissed, and had his property removed from the street. Elizabeth offered compensation a number, she said quickly, with the reflex of someone who has resolved most problems in her professional life with money. The look on Mason's face when she said it was worse than anger. It was recognition. He said she still didn't understand what she had done. She was standing in a machine shop, trying to buy his cooperation the same way she had eliminated the inconvenience of his van, with the unquestioned assumption that everything had a price, and she had the authority to set it. He said, and his voice was even and deliberate. "You didn't tow my van. You towed 3 years of my life. And now you want to pay me to act like it didn't happen." Elizabeth returned to Sterling, under enormous pressure. The board convened in an emergency session. Cameron Pierce, the longest-serving board member, presented a proposal in the language of pragmatic necessity. They had the technical documentation Samuel had received. The device was in a van they could access through an emergency property release, and Mason Walker was a private individual, with no legal team and no resources for a protracted dispute. He said that by the time any challenge was resolved, the commercial value would already be captured. He said it without hesitation, in a calm boardroom voice, as though he were discussing a supply chain adjustment. Samuel stood up. He said that if any version of that plan was executed, he would resign that afternoon, provide a sworn affidavit to any court that requested one, and contact David Reynolds personally to explain what had occurred. He sat down. No one spoke for a moment. Elizabeth was staring at the surface of the conference table. She had been in this industry long enough to have heard arguments like Cameron's before, and she had sometimes found them persuasive. She was thinking about the first decade of her career, when she had been the person without access, without the right credentials, dismissed by people in rooms exactly like this one, and how many times she had sat outside the door while the decision was made without her. She was thinking about the fact that she had spent years telling herself the ruthlessness she had developed was a professional tool, a survival mechanism, not a character trait. The events of the morning had raised a very uncomfortable question about which one it actually was. Jessica set a tablet in front of her without a word. It was showing the playback from the front gate security camera. Elizabeth watched herself step out of the sedan. She watched Mason step forward and begin to speak. She watched herself deliver 2 words and continue walking. She watched Mason's face as the glass door closed between them. The timestamp in the corner read 8:17 in the morning. She watched it twice. She made two decisions before she stood up from the table. The first was that Cameron's proposal was dead, and she would say so in a way that closed the discussion permanently. The second was that she was going back to Mason Walker alone, without lawyers, without board members, without anything to offer, except an acknowledgement of what had actually happened. She told the room that Sterling's position was that HelioCore belonged to its inventor, and that no legal action of any kind would be taken to access or replicate the technology without Mason's explicit agreement. Cameron said that was an extraordinary position to take 20 minutes before a potential $400 million deal collapsed. Elizabeth said she was aware of what it was. Before she left the building, she unclipped the CEO badge from her jacket lapel and put it in her coat pocket. She was not going to the machine shop as the chief executive of Sterling Dynamics. She was going as the person who had been wrong. The shop on County Road 11 was quieter when Elizabeth arrived the second time, Samuel beside her. Mason finished the repair he had been working on before he turned to face them. Elizabeth waited until she had his full attention. Then, she spoke without preamble or qualification. She said she had watched the security footage from that morning. She said she had seen herself cut him off. She said she had made a decision based entirely on the appearance of his vehicle and his clothing, and that neither of those things had anything to do with who he was or what he had brought with him. She said the decision had been wrong, that it had caused him direct harm, and that she was sorry for it, not for the operational consequences to Sterling, but for what she had communicated to him as a person when she dismissed him without a word. She said she understood if he didn't accept the apology, and that she was not asking him to. Mason sat on a metal stool and listened to the entire thing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said he had been turned away from enough places, by enough people who looked exactly like her, that he had stopped being surprised by it, but that it still hurt every time, in a way that did not diminish with repetition. He said he had come to Sterling because HelioCore deserved to be made, because the technology was real and it worked and it mattered, not because he needed anyone's validation. He had come because Samuel had been the first person in years to look at the work and see the work. Samuel spoke then, and what he said was not an argument, but a plain statement of fact. He said that if HelioCore was damaged in the impound facility, jostled during a vehicle inspection, opened improperly, subjected to overnight temperature swings in an unsheltered lot, they might not be looking at a postponement. They might be looking at the permanent loss of a device that could not be easily rebuilt on a timeline that would matter. The data drive was in there too. 3 years of work with no duplicate. The question, he said, was not whether to trust Elizabeth Carter. It was whether Mason was willing to let HelioCore sit in a tow yard over what Elizabeth Carter had done. The silence that followed was where Mason made his decision, and it was visible in his face as he made it. He said he would go. He stated 3 conditions clearly and without negotiation. Sterling would not handle the device under any circumstances without his direct supervision. Every meeting in which HelioCore's capabilities were discussed would include his name in the official record as its inventor. No one at Sterling would refer to HelioCore as a Sterling product, a Sterling development, or a Sterling prototype in any public or internal communication. Elizabeth agreed to all 3 without hesitation or qualification. Jessica produced a written temporary agreement. Samuel signed as witness. Mason read every line before he signed. The impound release was completed within 30 minutes. Mason opened the van himself, climbed in, and moved directly to the padded crate in the back. He examined the device in silence, running his fingers along the connection points and casing joints with the attentiveness of someone inspecting an injury. The crate had shifted approximately 4 inches during towing. A corner bracket had cracked. The core assembly looked intact, but the voltage regulator needed replacement before any load could be applied safely. The replacement was in his garage back in Millbrook. He looked up at Elizabeth and said nothing more. She said, "Then let's go." Back in the garage, Mason worked with a speed and fluency that transformed the cramped space tools coming off the pegboard and returning in a rhythm that looked almost meditative, the work table organizing itself around the task. The conversation between him and Samuel shifting immediately into the register of 2 engineers working a problem, quick and free of the social architecture that governed every other exchange Elizabeth had been part of that day. Elizabeth stayed out of the way at first and watched, and she recognized that she was in the presence of a kind of intelligence her professional world had trained her not to see. Not because it was hidden, but because it didn't arrive with the right packaging. It arrived in a rented garage wearing a cracked work jacket, and it knew things that her highest-paid engineers had not been able to figure out. At one point, she asked if she could help. Mason handed her a flashlight and told her to hold it steady on the left side of the junction board. Several minutes later, she adjusted the angle when a shadow fell across the component he was working on, and Mason said flatly, without looking up, "Don't move it." She moved it back and said sorry, and that was all. Samuel registered this without comment. A brief call came in Grace checking in, as she apparently did when her father was on a late job. Mason told her the repair was going fine, that he'd explain everything when he got home. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Meanwhile, at Sterling, Cameron Pierce had contacted the legal department about a potential licensing claim framed around work developed in consultation with Sterling's engineering team. Jessica discovered the draft and called Elizabeth, whose voice when she responded was quiet and clear. No action of any kind relating to HelioCore was to be prepared or filed without her explicit written authorization, and Cameron Pierce was not to contact the legal department on this subject again. The voltage regulator replacement took 1 hour and 40 minutes. When Mason powered the device through a preliminary check on the bench, the readings were clean. He ran a short load test enough to confirm the repair had held and calibration was intact. The numbers matched his reference logs within 0.5%. He powered it down, secured the casing, and looked at the time. It was 4:51 in the afternoon. The deadline was 6, and there was no time to transport the device to Sterling's headquarters and set up a proper equipment room. The only option was to connect Northbridge by video and run the demonstration from the garage. Mason suggested this without inflection, as though it were a straightforward logistical fact, which it was. Elizabeth hesitated for exactly 2 seconds long, enough for everyone present to see the instinctive resistance to presenting this technology from a rented garage in a suburb rather than from Sterling's 14th floor demo suite. Then she said, "Set it up." The room Mason Walker had built HelioCore in was the room where it was demonstrated to the most demanding investment audience Sterling Dynamics had ever faced, and the lack of a stage or a Sterling logo in the background did nothing to diminish what the data showed. When David Reynolds appeared on the laptop screen at 5:17 and looked at the garage behind Mason, he considered it for a long moment before saying, "Mr. Walker, show me what you have." Reynolds asked 7 technical questions in the first 10 minutes, each designed to locate the gap between what a device's builder claims and what the device actually does. Mason answered all 7 with the directness of someone who had already asked himself harder versions of the same questions and had built the answers into the design. When Mason powered HelioCore to full load, a brief vibration moved through the casing, a harmonic that had been present since the repair, which Mason had noted and not yet been entirely certain about. Every person in the garage went still. Mason adjusted the mounting tension on the secondary bracket by a quarter turn with a hand tool, without powering down, without any change in his composure. The vibration stopped. The output curve rose smoothly and held. Samuel read the performance figures aloud for the camera. Reynolds' analysts were writing. Reynolds watched the display in silence for almost 30 seconds, then asked Mason to run the device at 120% of its rated load, a stress test that exceeded the parameters Mason had originally specified, and that put real risk on a component that had already been repaired. That afternoon, Elizabeth, just outside the camera frame, said quietly to Samuel that they should not be doing this, that the unit had already sustained damage and an overrun was a serious risk. Samuel looked at Mason. Mason had heard her. He said, without turning around, "My call." He increased the load. The display climbed. The temperature readout rose 4 degrees above baseline and stabilized. The current output held within 2% of the target. The device ran at 120% of rated load for 6 minutes and 40 seconds before Mason powered it back to nominal and made a quiet note in his hardcover log. Then, he looked at the camera and said he was done with the demonstration and would answer any remaining questions. Reynolds spent 9 minutes on those questions. At the end of the 9th minute, he sat back slightly in his chair, a small movement that everyone in the room read correctly. He said Northbridge was prepared to continue discussions with Sterling Dynamics on the basis of the HelioCore technology, contingent on a formal agreement that correctly identified the inventor and protected the intellectual property appropriately. He looked directly at Elizabeth and said, "This is the kind of thing we invest in, not the building, not the brand, not the marketing language. This." Elizabeth spoke then. She looked at Mason, first one hand resting on the side of HelioCore, standing in the same garage where he had built it, and she addressed the assembled group: Reynolds, his team, Samuel, Jessica, and anyone at Sterling who would eventually hear the recording. She said clearly that HelioCore had not been developed by Sterling Dynamics. It had been developed by Mason Walker, independently, over 3 years, at his own expense and without institutional support. She said that if any partnership proceeded, Mason would be named as primary inventor in every document, patent filing, and public communication. She said Sterling's role in this story was not the origin of the technology but its distribution, and it would be represented as such, or the partnership would not move forward. Cameron Pierce, listening from his office at Sterling, understood that he had lost the argument, and that Reynolds' expression in the final moments of the call made clear that the attribution was not what had cost Sterling anything. The transparency was, in Reynolds' estimation, the most credible thing Sterling had done all day. The Sterling Dynamics board convened formally the following morning. Cameron Pierce argued that Elizabeth's public attribution of HelioCore to Mason Walker represented a governance failure and a breach of fiduciary responsibility. Elizabeth let him finish. She then addressed the board for 11 minutes, not as a defense, but as a precise account. The sequence of events at the front gate, the consequences that followed, the choices she had made in the garage in Millbrook and in the 14th floor conference room. She said the Northbridge deal would proceed on the terms she had committed to, and that any board member who believed that represented a failure of leadership was entitled to say so. No one did. Reynolds had already contacted the board chair before the session opened. He said that the transparency of Sterling's CEO under difficult circumstances was the most compelling indicator of institutional reliability he had encountered in 3 years of evaluating deals in this sector. The board voted 8-2 to proceed on Elizabeth's recommended terms. Mason attended the session as an observer. Afterward, he met with Sterling's general counsel and the intellectual property attorney he had hired overnight, Rebecca Cho, based in Indianapolis, a specialist in inventor rights who had reviewed the garage agreement and proposed 2 revisions. Sterling accepted both. The final terms assigned full inventorship of HelioCore to Mason Walker, established a revenue-sharing structure giving him 22% of net licensing income, and required Sterling to acknowledge the independent origin of the technology in all public communications for a minimum of 10 years. Cameron Pierce tendered his resignation 4 days later. Elizabeth accepted it with a single paragraph that said she wished him well and that the company's priorities had evolved. Everyone who read it understood what it meant. The rusted Ford Econoline van was transported to the Sterling Dynamics campus at Mason's authorization and Elizabeth's direction, and placed in the ground floor visitor atrium, not hidden in a back corner, but positioned in the space normally reserved for product displays and engineering achievement timelines. A single printed card beside it read, "This vehicle carried the prototype that changed this company. We almost didn't let it through the gate." It said nothing else. It didn't need to. Elizabeth stood in front of the van the morning it was installed, alone, before the building opened for the day. She looked at the rust on the wheel arches, the cracked side mirror, the electrical tape, the dents accumulated over years of roads that had not been kind to old vehicles. She had looked at this van once before and seen a problem to be removed. She understood now what she had actually been looking at the physical evidence of a person who had given every available resource to an idea he believed in, who had arrived at her door with exactly what she needed, and whom she had dismissed because the container didn't match her expectations of what value was supposed to look like. Several months passed, and HelioCore moved from demonstration unit to pilot production. Mason remained in Millbrook, in the same house, with the same garage, though the garage had been upgraded with equipment the partnership had made possible, and the pegboard held new tools that were not salvaged. He continued to work in the methodical, unhurried way he always had, except that now he had a team of 4 engineers who had applied for positions at what the industry press was beginning to describe as one of the most interesting, independent to corporate technology partnerships in the clean energy sector. Samuel Brooks led the formal evaluation structure for the partnership, insisting on an arrangement in which Mason retained technical authority over all decisions relating to HelioCore's core design. Sterling Dynamics introduced a program through which independent inventors could submit work for evaluation under a process that assessed technical merit before assessing anything about the person who had done it. The criteria were public. The timeline was defined. The evaluators were required to document their reasoning. In the first year, Sterling received 411 submissions. 17 were advanced to development discussions. 3 resulted in licensing agreements. 2 of those 3 inventors had previously been turned away by other major companies in the sector. Elizabeth Carter remained CEO. She did not become a softer person, in the sense sometimes used as a synonym for less effective. She remained precise, demanding, and committed to outcomes. But she listened longer before speaking. She asked questions that assumed less. She told the story of the van, the sequence of events, the choices made on both sides of the glass door in the company's leadership development sessions, not as a cautionary tale about operational mistakes, but as a precise account of how a person's internal assumptions can override their judgment and what it costs when they do. Mason and Elizabeth did not become close friends. The distance between them did not resolve into easy warmth. Their relationship was the kind that grows slowly into something harder to name, and more durable, a mutual recognition built on honesty, on the memory of a morning when everything could have gone differently, and on the ongoing work of building something together that neither of them could have built alone. When HelioCore's formal commercial launch took place in the Sterling atrium, the rusted van was still there, because no one had decided to move it, and several people had specifically decided not to. Elizabeth introduced Mason from the stage. She did not call him a partner, or a collaborator, or an independent inventor who had been fortunate enough to find the right audience. She said he was the person who had built HelioCore, that Sterling was proud to be part of bringing it to the world, and that the company owed him something it could not fully repay, not just the revenue share and not just the attribution, but an honest acknowledgement that Sterling had nearly failed to deserve the opportunity that had been offered to it on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Mason stood at the podium and looked out at the room. He saw Grace in the 3rd row, watching him with the specific pride of someone who has watched a person they love be underestimated for a long time, and then watch the world finally catch up. He placed his hand flat on the surface of the HelioCore demonstration unit on the table beside him, the same device from the garage in Millbrook, now housed in a clean enclosure, and he said that the most important things he had ever learned, he had learned in a rented garage with second-hand tools, and that this had never made them less true. He said that sometimes the most valuable thing in any situation is the thing that no one thought to look inside. He said he hoped that was worth remembering. What Mason Walker knew, and what the events of that day had made undeniable to everyone who had witnessed them, was something that did not require a demonstration, or a boardroom, or a $400 million contract to establish that the worth of a person is not contained in the vehicle they drive, the clothes they wear, or the door they are not permitted to walk through. It lives, stubbornly and without apology, in the work they do when no one is watching, and in precisely what they carry with them when they arrive at the gate for the very first time, with nothing but the thing they built, the years they gave to it, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that it is real and that it matters.